They said my aunt left me nothing. That she changed her mind. But when the housekeeper slipped me an old cassette tape, everything they lied about came crashing down. Claire Morgan never thought she'd be the kind of person who would one day question her own family. She grew up believing loyalty came before doubt, and that blood, no matter how messy, always mattered. But standing in front of her late Aunt Josephine's towering estate for the first time in years, that belief began to crack. Claire had been raised by a single mother in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn. Her mom worked 2 jobs and leaned heavily on Josephine, her older, glamorous sister, for support. Josephine wasn't just family, she was a lifeline. A world-famous jazz singer in her youth, Josephine had retired early, investing wisely and retreating to a massive countryside home just north of Hartford, Connecticut. She never had children of her own, but Claire was the closest thing. Summers at Josephine's were Claire's escape from reality. The house was a maze of music, history, and warmth. She and her aunt would spend hours at the grand piano, writing little songs, laughing late into the night, and listening to old records over tea. Josephine taught Claire how to play jazz, how to read a room, how to trust her instincts. When Claire left for college, Josephine helped pay tuition. She wasn't just generous, she was invested. Always reminding Claire, "You've got a quiet fire. Don't let anyone tell you that's not strength." But time, distance, and busy lives got in the way. Claire got a job in publishing, moved to the city, and her visits grew less frequent. Their bond never broke. It just faded into long phone calls and birthday cards. Then came the call. Josephine had died, suddenly, from a stroke. No drawn-out illness, no chance for final words. Claire was devastated, but also confused. She had always assumed that when the time came, she'd be contacted directly. Instead, it was her cousins, Brent and Thomas Morgan, who reached out. Brent and Thomas were Josephine's nephews through marriage. Sons of her late husband's brother, they came into her life after Josephine was widowed and had grown increasingly close to her in her final years. Claire remembered them vaguely. 2 slick-talking, suit-wearing men who always showed up to family functions late and left with leftovers and liquor bottles. They were never close with Josephine. In fact, they rarely visited while Claire lived there. But now they were suddenly everywhere, organizing the funeral, controlling the estate, and insisting that Josephine had amended her will shortly before her death. At the reading, Claire sat quietly in the back as Brent, with faux solemnity, read aloud the legal summary. Josephine's assets, her house, her music rights, and everything else, were left to him and Thomas. Claire's name wasn't even mentioned. When she finally worked up the nerve to ask questions, Brent gave a condescending smile. "Sorry, Claire. Aunt Jo made some changes. I guess she just didn't want to burden you with the responsibility." Thomas added, "She left you something though. Check the guest bedroom." Back in the room she used to call her second home, Claire found a small wooden jewelry box on the nightstand. Inside was an old brooch and a handwritten note. "Always know your worth." It was the kind of message Josephine might have whispered after a hard day. But it felt off. Like something was missing. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note, trying to convince herself that maybe Josephine had her reasons. But her gut said otherwise. And that night, just as she was about to leave, the housekeeper, Elena, knocked quietly on her door. "I have something you need to hear," Elena said. "Something your aunt wanted you to have, if things didn't feel right." And with that, she handed Claire a dusty shoebox. Inside it, a cassette tape. Labeled in Josephine's handwriting. "If you're hearing this, they lied." Claire sat in the dimly lit guest room, the cassette tape in her hand like a relic from another lifetime. Her thumb traced the edges of the label, Josephine's handwriting, unmistakable. Soft, slanted, and full of urgency. "If you're hearing this, they lied." She hadn't heard those words in years. Cassette tapes were obsolete, and yet this one carried more weight than any legal document Brent or Thomas had waved in her face. She looked up at Elena, the housekeeper who had served her aunt for nearly 2 decades. Elena's expression was firm but emotional, her hands clenched in front of her apron. She gave it to me 6 weeks ago, Elena said quietly. Said if something happened to her, and the will didn't sound right, this would explain everything. Claire's heart thundered in her chest. Why didn't you give it to the lawyer? I didn't trust them, Elena replied. Especially not Brent. He started coming around too often near the end. Always alone. Always leaving with files from the study. Claire nodded. She had felt it too, something was off. The next morning, Claire searched the house for something, anything, that could play a cassette. In a dusty box in the attic, buried beneath VHS tapes and photo albums, she found it, an old portable cassette player with batteries so corroded they looked fossilized. After cleaning the contacts and replacing the batteries, she held her breath and slid the tape inside. Click. Whir. Then, her aunt's voice. Claire, if you're listening to this, it means what I feared most has happened. Her voice was tired but clear, with that same gentle strength Claire remembered from childhood. I tried to update the will through my usual lawyer, but Brent and Thomas interfered. I overheard them speaking with someone they called a fixer, someone who offered to help them replace the final version with one more favorable to them. I confronted Brent. He told me I was confused. That I was old. That no one would believe me. Claire's jaw clenched. I kept my real will hidden. And I made sure Elena knew who to contact if this happened. His name is Daniel Whitaker. He's my original attorney, the only one I trusted. His office is in Hartford. I left his card with Elena, tucked inside the lining of the tea tin in the kitchen pantry. If you're hearing this, go to him. He'll know what to do. Claire paused the tape. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted down to the kitchen, tore the pantry apart, and found the old Earl Grey tin. Inside the metal lining, taped with yellowing masking tape, was a business card. Daniel Whitaker, estate attorney. Claire's hands trembled as she called the number. A woman picked up. Whitaker Law Office. Claire's voice cracked. I'm Claire Morgan. I believe you represented my Aunt Josephine. There was a long pause. Then, we've been waiting for your call. 2 hours later, Daniel arrived at the estate. Not the young, sharp-talking type like Brent's legal consultant, but calm, older, with a heavy leather briefcase and eyes that had seen generations of family disputes. He sat across from Claire and Elena, unfolded the original documents, and said, Your aunt's final and legally binding will names you as the sole beneficiary. The estate. The archives. The house. All of it. She signed it in my office, on record, 2 weeks after the version Brent claimed was final. Claire stared at him, stunned. But, they said. Daniel cut her off. They lied. Outside the door, Brent and Thomas were laughing in the living room, preparing to toast their new property with bourbon and cigars. They had no idea the storm was about to hit. Claire stood at the top of the staircase, gripping the real will in one hand and the cassette player in the other. Below her, Brent and Thomas lounged in leather chairs like kings, their laughter echoing off the marble floor. Can you believe she just bought it? Brent chuckled, sipping bourbon. I almost felt bad for her. Thomas snorted. I didn't. She never fought for anything. Just like her mother. Always too soft. Claire's chest tightened. She had heard enough. She descended the staircase slowly, her heels clicking with authority, a sound that turned heads. Both men froze. Claire? Brent asked, confused. What's that? She didn't answer. She walked over to the living room table, placed the cassette player down, and hit play. Josephine's voice filled the room once again. If you're hearing this, they lied. The color drained from Brent's face. Thomas looked around like the walls were closing in. I kept the original will protected, Josephine's voice said calmly. Claire, I trusted you. I knew you'd do the right thing when the time came. Claire paused the tape and looked up at them, her voice level. This is your last chance to come clean. Brent laughed nervously. What? That's just her talking. You don't have proof. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a stamped, court-filed copy of the Real will, signed by Josephine, witnessed by her attorney, and notarized, 2 weeks after the fraudulent one they had presented. She dropped it on the table. "This is proof." Moments later, the front door opened. In walked Daniel Whitaker, briefcase in hand, flanked by 2 deputies and a local estate investigator. Brent jumped to his feet. "This is private property." "Correction," Daniel said coolly. "This is Claire's property." One of the deputies handed Brent and Thomas legal summonses. The investigator added, "We have probable cause for will tampering, fraud, and intentional misrepresentation of estate documents. You're not just losing the house, you're under investigation." Thomas began stammering, his smug confidence unraveling. This is ridiculous." Claire stepped closer. "You lied about a dying woman's final wishes. You thought I wouldn't check. You thought I was weak." Brent's voice cracked. "We didn't mean. You meant exactly what you did," she snapped. "You stole, you manipulated, and you tried to erase me from her life." The deputies gave them 10 minutes to collect their personal belongings before vacating the premises. Claire watched as they scrambled upstairs, 2 grown men suddenly reduced to cowards. Elena stood quietly in the hallway, her hands folded over her apron, tears in her eyes. Claire turned to her. "You kept the truth safe when no one else could." "Thank you." Elena nodded. "I couldn't let them take what wasn't theirs." 10 minutes later, Brent and Thomas were escorted off the property. No more bourbon, no more fake smiles, no more pretending they had won. As the front doors slammed shut behind them, the entire estate seemed to exhale. For the first time in years, peace returned to the house. The house was quiet now. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when everything is still, but not empty. Claire stood alone in the music room, sunlight pouring through the tall windows and falling across the grand piano where she and Aunt Josephine used to play duets. The lid was slightly open, as if waiting. Her fingers gently touched the keys. A soft note echoed through the room, clear, rich, familiar. She sat down on the bench and closed her eyes. For the first time since her aunt's death, she let herself feel it all, the grief, the betrayal, the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, being believed. Not just by the law, but by the woman who had raised her to be strong without noise, kind without weakness, and smart enough to know when to fight back. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Claire had spent her whole life shrinking for other people's comfort. Keeping quiet so no one would call her emotional. Smiling to hide how much their words had hurt. She had shown up to the will reading expecting nothing, told herself not to hope, and prepared to walk away with only memories. But Josephine had known her better than anyone. Her aunt hadn't just left her a house. She left her a legacy. The music room. The handwritten sheet music in the drawers. The leather-bound journals filled with stories no one else ever got to read. The echo of her laughter in the halls. The note that said, "Always know your worth." Now it all made sense. Claire stood and walked slowly through the house, every creaking floorboard bringing back a childhood memory. The hallway with the chipped wallpaper where she and Josephine used to race. The kitchen where they danced while cooking. The garden outside where they sipped iced tea and made up stories about the birds and the trees. Elena met her near the stairs, holding a cup of warm tea. "I thought you might need this," she said gently. Claire smiled, taking it with both hands. "You stayed loyal to her, even when they tried to erase me." "She was family to me too," Elena replied. "And so are you." Claire hugged her. "I'm not going to sell it," she said suddenly. "The house. I want to preserve it. Her music, her work, her memory, it belongs to the world, not just to me." Elena beamed. "She would have loved that." Claire nodded. "She told me once, if people try to write you out of the story, pick up the pen and write it yourself." That's exactly what she intended to do. Later that evening, Claire sat by the fireplace with a notebook open in her lap. She wrote a letter. Not to Brent or Thomas, but to her younger self. The girl who thought kindness was weakness. The girl who thought being quiet meant being forgotten. You are not invisible, she wrote. You are the ending they didn't see coming. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, the warmth of justice, of memory, and of love made the walls feel alive again. This wasn't just a home. It was a voice. And it would sing again. Speech balloon, what would you have done if someone lied about your inheritance? Would you have walked away, or gone searching for the truth? Fire, drop a comment below. Tell us your reaction, or just type, justice, if Aunt Josephine's voice gave you chills. Backhand index pointing down.